Make that Nazir Chavbeis. Okay, so we're going to learn two somewhat important topics that were covered this week in the daf. I believe Chav Gimel is tomorrow, or in Washington tonight, and we have Chav Beis, which was a couple of days ago. Okay, the Gemara brings up a topic on daf Chav Beis that we had a couple of times already in Nazir. We had once in Nidarim, and that is the topic of what is the role that the husband plays when he does hafara on his wife's Nidarim. So the two options are megas gayas or mi akar. What does the husband do? Right, the wife makes a neder. In our example here, she wants to become a Nazir. Right, the woman wants to become a Nazira. And the Baal says, no way. So there's two ways of looking at it. So the Gemara says, well, there's one way where the Baal says, no, you cannot be. And on the day he hears this, let's say it's 2 days later or 3 days later. So on the day he hears it, he says, no way. How do we view the previous 3 days? So does the husband uproot the neder from the beginning, and it's as though it never happened? Or does he cancel it from here on in? Okay, so the Gemara is dealing with that question. And the Gemara tries to bring a proof that, in fact, he uproots it from the beginning. Okay, so we're on 22a on the first line. Chaf Beis Amar Aleph, first line. Tashma. Ha'isha shenadra b'nazir v'nitmes. So a woman became a Nazira, okay, and then she became Tameh. V'yachakach hefer la'bayla. And then after she became Tameh, the husband said, no go. I'm not permitting you to become a Nazira. So the Gemara says, Mevia chatas ha'of ve'enu mevia olas ha'of. So we know that there are certain karbanos that have to be bought when you become tameh, right? It's called karban tuma. You bring a chatas and you bring an asham. You also bring an ola. Okay, let's forget about the asham for now. That's actually a machlokas between Rashi and Tosfos, the Mefarish and Tosfos, whether or not the asham has to be bought or not. But the Gemara is focusing on the chatas and the ola. So the question is, Gemara seems to differentiate that she only brings the chatas, but she doesn't bring the ola. Now again, she's not a Nazir, she's not a Nazira anymore, because even though she became Tameh, but because the husband annulled it, so it wipes out the Naziris. So the Gemara on the third line says, V'isaka daitach bal megas gayis. Hold on a second. If you think that the role that the husband plays in this case is only from what we call mikanul haba, from here on out, right? Meaning you can't go back in time. You see, this whole difference, this whole distinction is, do we actually go back in time and say this never happened, right? The best way to think about it, I don't know if you remember from Back to the Future, right? So if you remember when they're having the whole going back and forth to 1956, so Michael J. Fox's sister disappears in the picture. Why? Because her mother never got married, right? And they never had a child. And if you go back in time and change things around, then the future is going to be way different, right? It's the alternate universe that didn't happen. So when things get switched around, right, it's as though it literally didn't happen. So here, this husband is saying, you think that you were a Nazira for the last 3 days. I have news for you. You weren't. It's as though you didn't even become a Nazir. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. But if you say that it goes from here on in, so Teisinami Ola Sa'of. So you have to bring the Ola also. Why does the Gemara say that only the Chatas is bought? Hey, you should bring both. Why? Because she really was a Nazira, right? If you think that it's only from here on in I'm canceling the Nazira. Not that it was canceled way back from the beginning. So therefore, she should bring both karbanos. Now, the problem is, the Gemara says, but the kasha is also the other way, because the Gemara on the 5th line says, Ve'elamai me'akir akir. So what are you going to tell me that what? That we go back and we uproot the whole thing and she was never, ever a Nazir in the beginning? It was all a figment? It never happened? So chatas ha'of nami lo teise. So if she was never a Nazira in the beginning, then she shouldn't bring any karbanos. Forget the Ola. She doesn't have to bring a chatas because she was never a Nazira. So this is what we call a classic memanavshach, right? Make up your mind. What we're doing over here is we're splitting the proverbial baby. We're saying you bring one karban and not the other. So that doesn't really answer the question whether we view this annulment as from here on in, or do we go back retroactive? So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Which way do we go? So the Gemara says, you're right. In fact, he does go back to the beginning, and it was as though she never became a Nazir. But the truth is, you don't really have to bring a chatas ha'of. The only why we're bringing a chatas ha'of over here is because of a special reason. Because the chatas over here symbolizes something very important. So the Gemara says, Hachinami, you're right. You really the woman doesn't have to bring a chatas. So why does she? V'hamani Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar. The answer is because we rely on the view of Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, who we had 4 times already in this Masechta. So by now you should know this. The Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar Omer, Ma Talmud Lomer Me'asher Chata Al HaNefesh. The Chumash says that after a Kohen, after a Nazir, if in fact he becomes tameh, if he becomes impure, he has to bring a karban. He has to bring a karban because he was chata, he sinned. So the Gemara says, nefesh chata. What exactly did he do wrong? In fact, you could argue that he did something very, very virtuous. He decided to become a Nazir. So the answer is the reason is because this Nazir, or in this case, this Nazira, decided to abstain from wine. And anyone who abstains from wine is nikra chota, is considered a chota, period. So that answers the question as to why exactly does this woman have to become a Nazir? Does this woman have to bring a karban chatas? We answered, you're right. The Baal is ma'akir, the neder from the beginning. He wipes clean the neder from the beginning. However, the truth is that the only reason why she has to bring a chatas is not because of any reason. She wasn't a Nazira, but she made a decision. And her decision cost her a korban now. The decision of abstaining from things that are beneficial in the world. And one of those things is called wine. And the Gemara at the end says, parenthetically, and I could learn a kal v'chomer. If you only decide to take one thing, right, that you don't have to take, and you take it anyway as a chumrah, you're considered a choteh. If you decide to do anything, right, if you abstain from much more things, then so much more is the punishment that you're considered a choteh. So we actually spoke a little bit about this Gemara in the introduction class when we spoke about the Rambam and the Ramban, and is it a good thing to be a Nazir? Is it a bad thing to be a Nazir? The Gemara over here, actually on Chav Beis, doesn't discuss what it discussed a few daf ago on Yud Tes, because the problem with this Gemara is a simple question. If you actually look at the pasuk Me'asher Chata Al HaNefesh, where does this pasuk show up? This pasuk only shows up by a case of a Nazir that's tameh. So the Gemara says, yeah, I understand why you're sinning is because you're a tameh Nazir. But what if you made it through the whole Naziris unscathed? Are you still considered a choteh? So this is actually a question that the Gemara goes through different sides. Where on Daf Yotes, the Gemara actually said that what? That it says you are a choteh, right? This was the daf we had on Shabbos Daf Yotes. Right in the middle of the page, the Gemara actually asked this question. If you go to 19a, smack in the middle of the page, it says V'ha Nazir tameksiv, V'anana fil Nazir tahar kamrinan. This pasuk is talking about a Nazir Tameh, but the context that we're talking about, at least over there on Daf Yotes, was a Nazir Tahor. Now the context on Chav Beis was the woman who became Tameh. So that I understand. You're a choteh, but are you a choteh even if you're not Tameh? So the Gemara on Yotes says, well, Ksav Rabbi Lezer HaKapar, Nazir Tahor Nami Chotehu. He says it's both, right? The reason why, though the pasuk is written by a Nazir Tameh, is because you did two things wrong. First of all, you accepted upon yourself a Naziris that you probably shouldn't have. And B, you couldn't even stick to it. You became Tameh right away. So that just goes to show you that, you weren't really good with what you were doing. So that's on Daf Yotes. But on Daf Gimel, the plot thickens. Gimel way back in the beginning. Daf 3 in Nazir, on the 1, 2, 3, 5th line, you see what it says? Abel Nazir Tahor Lav Choteh Karibeh. We bring the same exact Gemara, and we say that only applies to a Nazir Tameh. A Nazir Tameh who has to go back and do all those days that he missed, and he has to bring a korban. That's a problem. That's when you're Choteh. But the Gemara ends off by saying on the 5th line, Abel Nazir Tahor Lav Choteh Karibeh. So even the Gemara is grappling, depending on the page, is this only by a Nazir Tahor? Is this only by a Nazir Tameh because you did something wrong? You couldn't even keep to your deal that you made and you became Tameh? Or do we say that it even applies to a Nazir Tahor? So we're going to get to a Tosfos soon that discusses it. But before we get to that, I want to take this concept, okay, which obviously is focusing on a Nazir and things that are enjoyable. So wine, obviously, throughout the Gemara is always that one thing that makes people happy. So wine is your paradigm for happiness. Let's just say, right? It says in simcha ela b'basar b'yayin, right? Yayin is a component. There's all kinds of Gemaras that say yayin is what brings bracha to the house. There's dozens of Gemaras that discuss wine and how great it is, and not only how great it is, how bad it is for you also, right? It's the ultimate double-edged sword, right? It brings you to shichrus and all kinds of bad things, right? It's always that paradigm that's great on the one hand, right? And bad on the other hand. So we're using that in the context of a Nazir. But let's look at it in a different context, okay? This is a discussion in Maseches Tainus. Okay, Maseches Tainus, that obviously talks about fast days, right? What else would Tainus talk about? The Gemara says on Daf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, and the topic is very similar, just like we're saying over here, is it virtuous to be a Nazir? We're saying, is it virtuous to be a Tainus, to sit in a Tainus? Is that a good thing or not? So Amar Shmuel, we're in the middle of Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph, and Tainus. Amar Shmuel kol hayoshev b'Tainus nikra choteh. So regarding the area of fasting, Shmuel is of the opinion that if you sit in a fast, you're called sinning. Why? Fasting is, fasting is great. So the answer is because of this exact Gemara that we quoted in Nazir. And he brings the Gemara says, well, because of the following opinion. The Tanya, Rabbi Lezer, Akapa, Rabbi Omer, Matal, Omer. He brings the whole discussion about Nazir, about Rabbi Lezer HaKapar. What he does is he uses the context of abstaining from the good things in life, right, to a Nazir. Just like a Nazir is getting punished, quote unquote, to bring a chatas, to bring a sacrifice, so too, someone who's abstaining himself or herself from eating or drinking is doing the same thing. So it's not wine specific, but it's the general idea of fasting. So we see one extension of this Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar is used in terms of whether fasting is a good thing or not. So the Meiri on that Gemara says, let's just understand something. He says, Kol hamat midleshe b'tainis yoser midai. So let's talk about these people who fast a lot. Now today, fasting is in the news because depending on who you ask, dietitians today recommend what they call this intermittent fasting, right? People fasting, right, once, twice a week, right, to lose weight, right? A few years ago, it became very popular. I don't know how successful it is. To me, it doesn't really make sense, but I'm not a dietitian. But all I could tell you is that the Meiri actually addresses this concept. And he says, well, it depends. If you're just fasting all the time, he says, if you're doing it because of refuah, says the Meiri, even though on the one hand, you might be called a chote, you're abstaining from pleasures that God gave us, right? The fact that he has whatever reason, whatever ailment is bothering him, presumably he or she is overweight, so therefore he or she needs to fast. It's good to do it. Right? You're not doing it because you're a holy person. You're doing it because your doctor is saying, hey, listen, if you fast 2 or 3 times a week, I'm telling you, by the end of 3 months, right, you'll have 35 pounds gone, right? And you'll look okay and you won't be afraid to go out in public. So that's one way of dealing with weight loss. Now, that doesn't mean you're a chassid because you say, oh, I'm going to fast and this and that. You're not doing it for that reason. You're doing it, right, because your doctor told you to do it. So let's take the other example. Let's say you don't need it for weight loss, right? You're in good shape, right? You weigh 165 pounds. You don't need to lose one ounce. So why are you fasting? You're fasting eladerech yira shamayim. The kavanat netiya el katze ha'achron. Kol shehu maimid chayaso bekach nikra kadosh v'chasid. He says if you do it the other way, then you're whoa, right? You're not eating, right? You're a holy person, right? You decide to abstain, then as they say, kol hakavod, right? That's someone that they call a kaddish and a chassid. Sheharei kol kavanaso. Lashus Hashem Yisbarach Negdo Tamid Ulvati Hafnos Machshot Menis. But he's doing it so that God it's always a reminder that God is in front of him, right? Just in case he strays. So here he's abstaining from the physical pleasures of life, like these monks or whomever, right? That would not eat on purpose, right? To be on that special level. What's interesting is that we didn't read the other part of the Gemara. The other Gemara in Tainus has an argument against Shmuel, and the next opinion says, no, if you sit and you fast all the time, you're considered a kadosh. So we see this almost the same machlokes by fasting by a Nazir. Is it virtuous? Is it not virtuous? And obviously, shades of the machlokes between the Rambam and the Ramban, which we mentioned also in the introduction, seem to pop up over here. The Rambam says it is absolutely not a good thing, right? We mentioned this 3 or 4 times already in Hilchos Deus. He warns against going too extreme. He says you got to stick to the middle, and when you see yourself veering off the road, you got to do what you can to go back in the middle. And he uses the Nazir as the paradigm, the one who decides to just take too many chumras and to be too religious. So you got to get back in the middle. So that's what the Rambam says. Now we know why he brings a chatas according to the Rambam. The problem is, what about the Ramban? The Ramban says in Parshas Naso, no, it's a beautiful thing. It's kadosh. You have, as they say, alamailas in Yiddish. So if that's the case, then why do you bring a carbon chatas? Right? Chatas, the Torah only gives you to give, only makes you give if you are in fact a sinner. If you're not a sinner, then you have no business bringing the carbon chatas. So
yeah, but even if you say, Bezalel, that it's not a good thing, what's the lav? You have to be in violation of a lav.
So I'm going to tell you. So let's read the Ramban, and he tells you why you bring it. Tam hachatas sheyaker v'nazir b'yom malos yimein Israel lo nitparesh. So the Ramban at least admits that it's not really explained. So he agrees that I'm stumped.
My question is on Rebbe Lezer Kapar.
Oh,
the Gemara. What's the lav? You have to have a lav. It's not just, I was like talking in shul.
No.
So you can't bring a chatas. No, I'm saying it has to be a lav.
You're right. I thought about that. It's a very good question. I haven't seen anyone who pinpoints, meaning abstaining from the beauties of the world may not be a great thing, but it's certainly not a lav. There's no mitzvah in drinking wine, just for the heck of it. Yeah, it's a mitzvah in regard to Kiddush, regard to Havdalah. It's like a hechsher mitzvah. It's part of many mitzvahs. But you're 100% right. It's a good question, and I haven't yet seen an answer. So you definitely stumped me on that one.
The only thing we could say is it's not a chatos, really. It's a chatos ha'of. It's not a real chatos.
Right, but it could also be a chatos. Right? I believe you have a choice. I think.
No, the pasuk says you bring two birds, one for an oil, one for
okay, but still, even the chatas ha'of was bought for sin. There aren't any voluntarily chatas ha'ofs that were bought either. So, all right, okay. Although I did see a distinction between the chatas ha'of by a chatas shemesu ba'aleha, right? The rule is that you have to kill it. There's actually a big machlokas whether that applies to animals or to birds also. That's in the Rambam. But anyway, not for now. So let's get back to the Ramban. The Ramban
didn't we say that actually a chatas ha'of is unique because it could be brought on a suffix?
Chatas is brought on a suffix, correct.
So that it is unique. So it's probably not a real chatas then.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you see that?
It's still strange.
Or are you making it up?
No, we did that in the Durham.
Okay. All right. So getting back to the Ramban, let's just read the Ramban. The Ramban says, well, I'll try to explain the reason why a Nazir, in fact, does bring a chatas. Because most people, right, the explanation is that when a person is chote, right, when he becomes a Nazir, kihu ata Nazir mikdushas avodas Hashem. What he's doing is now that he's complete, until now he was on a high level, right? He was all the way up. He's living on a high. Now, v'ra'i haya lo sheyazir la'olam, v'yamod kol yom of Nazir v'kadosh la'lokav. And if he had his druthers, he should have remained there forever. Forever what? Forever being a Nazir. But, as they say, all good things come to an end, right? And he says, Kol Yemei V'hinei Hu Tzarech Kapara B'shuva Lihitama B'tayva Sa'olam. Now he's going back to the real world, right? Back to the rat race. Now he needs an atonement. Why? Because he's going to go back and hear the words of the Ramban. Hutzarech kapara b'shuva lihitama b'tayva sa'olam. He requires an atonement, right? Because he goes back to be metame by the tava sa'olam, by the desires that are present in the world. So it's almost like, okay, you can't be in a bubble forever, right? You have to come out sometime, right? You can't stay in yeshiva forever. You have to go into the real world, right? So too over here, and his way back to the real world, that's why he needs a chatas. Almost like the Ramban is predicting that he's going to have the same issue again. he's going to get into trouble. So that's what the chatas is there to prevent. It's to prevent him getting back into trouble by giving in to his worldly desires. Now, obviously, the Rambam is much more, I'd say, accepted, because this sounds too perfect. Meaning, we're not supposed to be living in bubbles, right? We're not supposed to be, trapped where we don't have the opportunity to sin, because then it's not, it's no fun, it's no challenge. The whole point is to be where you could do both. You could do good, and you have to abstain from doing bad, right? It's no kunz, as they say, to be in a place where there's no evil, right? So that's why I never really, thought that this Ramban was very practical for us. I don't know, we could debate that. But anyways, that's my little editorial on the Ramban. So we've seen one instance, right, where the Gemara makes this extension about abstaining from wine, abstaining from food. Now we're going to shift gears to a Gemara in Bava Kama. All right, the Gemara in Bava Kama at the end of Hachovel, the 8th perek, talks about, the Mishnah is on Daf 90. There's a story in a Mishnah. It talks about doing damage to your friend. Okay, it talks of, and we actually brought this up about a year ago for an unrelated reason, but I'll just repeat a little bit of it anyway. The Gemara, the Mishnah on Daf Tzadi 90a on the bottom on Bava Kama says that there are certain fines that were given for embarrassing, right? We talked about embarrassment when we were doing Ksuvas, I think in the summer, if you remember, right? Boshes and Pagam, remember, by the Nar Marasa. I'm sorry, by rape, right? That one of the payments you pay is tsar and tsar and nezek and boshes, right? You're paying after you're doing something to a girl. So because she was humiliated, there's a certain fine and penalty that you pay. So the Mishnah in Bava Kama says, if you happen to uncover the hair of a woman in the street, you have to pay 400 zuz. Okay, and the Mishnah says there was a story about a person who uncovered someone's hair, right, in the street, and Rabbi Akiva said you had to pay her, like the Mishnah says, 400 zuz. So the man said, "Hey, give me a week. Okay, I have a way of getting out of this." So what happened was he cornered her once, and he broke a jar of oil, and she electively took off her head covering and started, in order to save the oil, she poured it in her hair. So what does that show? It shows that, hey, why am I paying her money for uncovering her hair when she does it herself? She obviously doesn't care about self-humiliation. So why do I have to pay her a fine? Right? So it sounds like a good point he made. So Rabbi Kiva said, no, you have no proof. You still have to pay, because the truth is, if you do something injurious to yourself, you inflict damage on yourself, you humiliate yourself, you run down the street naked, right? Even though it's not something great that you're doing, right? The Gemara discusses the problem with injuring yourself is baltashkas, believe it or not. Right? We have baltashkas by trees. We have baltashkas by throwing out food, and we have baltashkas by injuring ourselves or by embarrassing ourselves. Okay, so the Mishnah says, even though you shouldn't do it, but at the end of the day, you're putter, meaning it's not the worst thing. The Gemara on Daf Tzadi Aleph, Amud Aleph on the bottom, brings a brisa that says, V'atanya, I'm going to ask you a question. The Mishnah said that what? The Mishnah said that you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to embarrass yourself, but there's no penalty to yourself. Here the Gemara says, Amrulol Rabbi Kiva Tzalata b'mayim adir v'heleta cheres biadacha. The Gemara says that Rabbi Akiva told this person, hey, you had a great plan, right? You went deep sea fishing and you brought up junk from the ocean. Meaning you had a great plan, but you blew it. Because why? Because Adam Rasha lachbol b'yatzmo. Because in fact, the person can injure themselves. The Mishnah said that Rabbi Akiva says you can't, but there's no payment. So the question is, are you allowed to do something negative to yourself? That's what the Gemara is grappling over here. So Rava says, Lo kasha kan b'chabala kan b'boshes. So Rava tries to answer and says, well, it depends. What was our Mishnah talking about? Our Mishnah was talking about embarrassment. Maybe when it comes to embarrassing yourself, doing something silly, like in the case of the Mishnah, taking your head covering off or running down the street naked, right? Like these streakers, right, at the games where they run down right the field naked or they do whatever they want, right? So that's one thing, but to injure yourself is a different story. Okay, so the Gemara goes back and forth, and at the end of the day, the Gemara says Tanahi. In fact, we have two different opinions. So we're left with a machlokes. One side says you're allowed to injure yourself, and the other side says you're not allowed to injure yourself. Okay, so Gemara wants to know who is of the opinion that says Ein Adam Rasha Lachbol Be'atzmo. Who's the one? Which opinion says that you can't cause injury to yourself? And guess what the Gemara concludes? Exactly what our topic is. The Gemara links, right, the Nazir. I'll just skip to the end. The end is toward the bottom of 91b. Gemara says, Ella Haitanahu, the Tanya Amar Belezer Hakapar, Mata Belom, Bechipar Shal Machtal Nevish. Who's the one who says that what? That you are, in fact, not allowed to do damage to yourself? It's the same one who says that you can't do damage to yourself by the Nazir, by abstaining from wine. So, wow, this is really interesting. So I understand the Tainus Gemara about fasting is pretty well correlated to the Gemara in Nazir about not taking wine, right? Fasting, not drinking wine, right? They're kind of the same things. Here, the Gemara makes a very interesting leap, right? The leap is, I'm comparing Rabbi Lezer HaKapar about abstaining to doing physical damage to yourself. So I would call that a really big chiddush, right? Meaning it's one thing to abstain, to passively not take something, not take wine, not take food. That's one thing, but to actually injure yourself, that's what the Gemara is actually linking together. So I find that to be a very, very novel chiddush. And Tosfos actually brings up a good point. Tosfos, this Tosfos actually appears in Bava Kama. He says, I don't understand something. He asked the same question that I brought up in the first few minutes of even the Gemara in Nazir goes back and forth regarding the person not drinking wine. Is it talking about a Nazir Tahor, or is it talking about only a Nazir Tameh? So Tosfos in Bava Kama asked this question and says, which one is it? Right? The Tema. In the beginning of Nazir, on Daf Gimel, I'm just paraphrasing, it says that what? It says that it's only by, right, a Nazir is chota, only by a Nazir Tameh, right? Because he shouldn't have taken Naziris, and he blew it right away by not becoming, right, by becoming Tameh, and now he's got to make up all those days that he lost. So, but a Nazir Tahor is not considered a chota. Now the Gemara says, even a Nazir Tahor is also considered a chota. So the Gemara wants to know, yes, you have a question? BJ. Does BJ have a question? No, he doesn't have a question. So the Gemara, so Tosfos says, well, which one is it? Okay, so here's Rabbeinu Tam, very famous Rabbeinu Tam. It's found in Tosfos and Bava Kama. Says, Hadekama delo havechote, hainu shemitzvah gedola min ha'avera. He says, we have basically what I called before this double-edged sword. You have this mitzvah of Nazirus, that has like, call it like a byproduct. A byproduct or a part of it involves the chet. It's very rare that you have this mitzvah, right, to become a Nazir and do all these things. And when you actually look at it under a microscope, you'll see that one element of it has a sin element in it. So that's exactly what Rabbeinu Tam says. But if you look at it quantitatively, the mitzvah is much greater than the avera. The mitzvah lidor. Whoa. So he's going to say something very controversial. We've been saying, and we brought this 4 times in Maseches Nedarim, 3 times in Maseches Nedarim, that it's a sin to make a neder. You remember we did this so many times together? You can't make a neder. It's like you build a bama, right? A altar that you're not allowed to. So Rabbeinu Tam says there's certain circumstances where you're allowed to. You know when you're allowed to? You're allowed to become a Nazir if you see a sota. If you see how the sota was affected by wine, and now she's being schlepped up by her husband and going through the whole process, right, which is very, very degrading, he or she is going to proactively separate themselves from wine. So the Rabbeinu Tam and Tosfos and Bava Kama calls that a mitzvah. Meaning what? Take a lesson, right? Sometimes the biggest lessons we learn in life is from something that we see, right? It's one thing to learn in a book and to say, okay, it's a mitzvah to do this. It's another thing to actually witness an event and come to your own conclusion and say, you know what? I'm not drinking any wine anymore. I see what that woman went through. So that's what the Rabbeinu Tam calls a mitzvah. But he says, umikol makom kitzas yesh chet. There's a little bit of a sin in there also. So now he's going to compare it to something that we may have seen before, and that's the rule about fasting on Shabbos. So there happens to be a rule that we do not fast on Shabbos, right? It's no coincidence that most of the fast days don't occur on Shabbos. The Gemara does say that if, I think it is Asara B'Tevis falls out on Shabbos, it doesn't, but the Gemara said if it were to, you would actually fast on Shabbos. What that means is a whole topic within itself, but putting that aside, right, by Tisha B'Av we don't fast on Shabbos, but we do on Yom Kippur. So it's a bad thing to fast on Shabbos. The Shulchan Aruch says there's one exception. If you have a tainus cholom, if you have a horrible nightmare, right, on Friday night, something really, really horrible nightmare, you're allowed to fast on Shabbos. Now, does that mean that it's a mitzvah? You're not allowed to. So Tosfos is comparing this concept of this mitzvah of Nazirus with a little bit of a side dish of a sin, right? He's saying the same thing is true to fasting on Shabbos. Shekorin gzardino v'nifra'in mimenu tainis shel Shabbos. What that basically means is that they rip your gzardin and they make you pay for it by fasting again. Ma'ita kante leisiv tanisa l'tanisa. So it's an interesting situation because you're not supposed to, but you have to. So what does that mean? Your punishment for fasting on Shabbos is to fast Sunday. So you have to fast 2 days in a row. I believe you're allowed to eat or drink at night, like Ramadan, but you have to fast 2 days in a row. Your punishment for fasting on Shabbos that you shouldn't normally do, but you have no choice because you had a nightmare, so you have to make up for it by fasting on Sunday. Shemitzvah gedola min havera, and Rabbeinu Tam beautifully uses that same concept that it's a mitzvah and avera wrapped into one, but the mitzvah is just a little bit bigger. So that's why you have to fast on Shabbos. You have to become a Nazir, or a woman has to become a Nazira if you witnessed what they do to this poor sota, right? So I thought that was a very beautiful point in how we kind of handle, like we start off the class, these two Gemaras, the one on Daf Gimel, the one on Daf Yotes, that seems to contradict, well, is this choteh by a Nazir only by a Tamei Nazir or even by a Tahar Nazir? So the answer is it's a little bit of both. It's this hybrid where even in the greatness and this mitzvah of Nazirus, there's still a little element of chait. So I thought the Rabbeinu Tam said that perfectly. And just getting back to that Gemara in Bava Kama. Okay. So basically the conclusion of the Gemara is, so yeah, when it comes to damaging yourself, it's one thing, but when it comes to boshes, right, when it comes to humiliating yourself, if you don't really care walking around the street naked, then go ahead, right? It's not certainly not virtuous, but it's much different than obviously than injuring yourself. So I thought that was a very interesting way of how we link these two related Gemaras, one in Tainus and one in Bava Kama, how we tie that into the concept regarding the Nazir. Just as a conclusion about this concept of abstaining, so I actually brought this down about 2 years ago in one of the first classes, is this Yerushalmi, let me find it, in Kedushin. The Yerushalmi at the end of Kedushin says the following. Rab Chizkiya Rebbe Cohen b'Shem Rab Asar ladur be'ir she'ein ba lo rofe v'lo merchatz v'lo beis din makan b'chovshin. You're not allowed to live in a city which doesn't have a doctor or a bathhouse or a court where they could punish you. Amar Rab Yossi B'Rabun Af Asar ladur be'ir she'ein ba ginusa shel yerek. It's also forbidden to live in a city that doesn't have a garden that has in it vegetables. Rab Chizkiya Rebbe Cohen b'Shem Rav Asid Adam Liten din v'cheshbon al shema sharasa eino v'lo achal. He says a person inevitably will have to justify to himself in the world to come, right? You have to give din v'cheshbon. You're going to have to give an accounting. You're going to have to, as they say, faren for yourself, right? In front of God for everything that your eyes saw and you didn't eat. Rab Leiser Chashish Lahada Shmuasa. Rab Leiser took note of this statement, Umatz Mislei Pritin, and he would save coins throughout the whole year. He'd have a piggy bank. And anytime he had spare change, he would put it away. And he used to take those coins and he ate fruits once a year that were rare and precious to him from all the money he collected. We bring this Gemara, this Yerushalmi, it's a rather famous Yerushalmi, or it became famous from the story of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which basically is the Have You Seen My Alps story, where in the 1880s when he was very old, so he was often seen going on vacation a lot. So they wanted to know why he just was always going on vacation to the Alps. Right, he lived in Germany and he used to go to Switzerland a lot. And the Talmidim asked him, and he said, "This is the Yerushalmi, and when God says, Rab Shimshon, how come you haven't seen my Alps?" I'm not going to have an answer. So this is tying. So this goes back, I think, to the whole discussion about why is it that we must benefit, right, from the wine, right? Abstaining is not good. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be a hedonist, right, and do all kinds of crazy things. However, this Yerushalmi certainly gives us the license to in fact enjoy ourselves. It's a very big topic. This is actually a topic within itself. I just thought I'd bring it down. Look in the it's interesting. The Pnei Moshe is a mefurish on the Yerushalmi. And he says, it's very interesting words that Yerushalmi uses. It says, you're going to have to give an accounting for what your eyes saw, v'lo achal, and didn't eat. Now, the word achal doesn't sometimes it means eat. It also means didn't take advantage of, right? We have an opportunity, right? The world is full of opportunities. And if we don't take the opportunity, what God gave us, the words of the Pnei Moshe, Shenafsho mistagefes, behitaivas al davar, v'nimtza chota al hanefesh. When we have an urge to do something and we don't do it, obviously good urges. There are all kinds of bad urges. But the assumption over here is something that is in, right, something that's in the ballpark for us. Okay, v'nimtza chota, we're considered a chota, just like Rabbi Lezer HaKapar, right, says. So now this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to devote your life to be a National Geographic photographer and go all around the world and see the Alps and see all the 7 seas and go crazy. But I think what the takeaway is from this Yishalmi, and that's really the most important part, is that sometimes you read this and like, okay, well, what does it mean for me? So I think it means that we have a big, beautiful world, and it's just don't miss an opportunity to do this. Don't miss an opportunity to do that. Take mild risks, and just be proactive. And you see how the Gemara reacts to this concept of whether not eating or not enjoying wine. Right? Don't be too holy. I think it's a very lovely concept, and we could all learn a lot from it. Let us switch gears to Daf Chav Gimel. Okay, Chav Gimel. Chav Gimel is the most famous daf in Nazir, because we finally have a sidetrack to all this technical stuff, and there's some very, very profound insights on page 23 in Nazir. I think that's the daf for tomorrow, which means tonight in Washington. And this daf could take 2 or 3 hours, depending on how in depth you go. I want to just give a little snippet, because the Mishnah talks about something very interesting. It's a concept that we think about a lot, and we don't really know what the answer is. Okay. Ha'isha shenadra benazir v'haisa shose b'yayin mutamel ames. So the Mishnah says, obviously, so a woman who became a Nazir, and for whatever reason, she started to sin and she couldn't handle it. So we say, Harizas Sarbaim. So this is a classic case. You become a Nazira. That's it. You blew it after a week. So you get your Malkus. Very easy. So here the plot thickens. She became a Nazira. Great. The problem is her husband annulled it. She didn't know. So she says, I'm going to rebel. I'm going to do all my things. I'm going to drink wine. I'm going to go to the cemetery. She's thinking the whole time that she's rebelling. Little does she know, the joke's on her. That what? That her husband called it off. So the Mishnah says she doesn't get the 40 Malkus. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Imeino Sofeges es Arboim Tispog Makas Mardus. Rabbi Yehuda says, you're right. Technically, she doesn't get Malkus because at the bottom line is she's not in a zero. Now, she may not have known that. So here we talk about intent. Her intent, we know, was bad. Bad intent. However, what was the impact? The impact was no harm done because she wasn't in a zero. So the Tanakama says she gets nothing. Rabbi Yehuda says, okay, she gets Makas Mardus. What Makas Mardus is a whole discussion. The Bartanura talks about it, that the Rabbanon would punish her the way they see fit, and it wasn't done with as much force as the Malkus. Right? Whatever it is, it was done a little bit differently, but on a Rabbanon level. So the Gemara takes the opportunity, because you see already the concept over here of intent, right? Usually the problem is the other way, that we have, let's just stick to the Gemara. Tanar Banan, 23a on the top, Gemara. Isha haferim v'Hashem yislach la. The pasuk says that the husband will annul it and Hashem will forgive her. So the Gemara doesn't understand what's going on over here. If she's not a Nazira anymore, then what kind of forgiveness does she need? Why does the Torah have to say that God will forgive her? Well, of course God will forgive her. The husband said it's a no-go, so she's not a Nazir. So what's the discussion? So Gemara says, not so quick. Here we have one of these cases where she doesn't know. Like the Mishnah says, she doesn't know, and yet she needs atonement. Wow. She needs atonement, but she didn't do anything wrong. So that statement perplexed Rabbi Akiva. And when Rabbi Akiva reached this pasuk, he couldn't contain himself. Now, usually Rabbi Akiva in Shas is very optimistic. He's stoic. He's laughing, right? This is the great Rabbi Akiva, right, who keeps his composure. This time he couldn't keep his composure. Again, why? Let's just do a little bit. If I have a case where a person was all ready to eat non-kosher, and by a miracle, the food got switched, right? Usually it's the opposite. By miracle, the food got switched and it's kosher. And he walks out of that restaurant saying, wow, that was the best non-kosher food I've ever eaten. The problem is it was really kosher, right? So does he need to bring a korban? It's a good question, right? Ends, means, right? You could see the whole, right, philosophical problem over here. So the Gemara says absolutely he needs kapara, he needs slicha. So could you imagine if a person wants to eat not kosher and he ends up not eating not kosher? So you have bad intent and you have the impact, which was bad. Everything was bad. Alachas kama v'kama. Certainly, you need kapara. Okay, so this is so what makes this unique is because there's a lot of talk these days about this whole concept of intent versus impact, right? Usually we have the opposite problem. A person, right? What do they say? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? Everybody knows that statement because today all you got to do is turn on the news and everybody's apologizing. Everybody's saying, I didn't mean to do it. I try to do the right thing and look what happened, right? That's all everyone ever says today, right? The intent was there, but at the end of the day, right, it backfired, right? You have a disaster. I tried to help her and I ended up hurting her. Fill in the blanks. This is society today, right? So how do you correct that? So there's articles I saw, we don't have enough time to talk about it, but it's a fascinating thing. Why is it that so many things we try to do always end up in a bomb? Anyways, here, so you're not going to find this because this is very, very rare. Here you have bad intent, right? You want to eat non-kosher. Miraculously, you get saved because the waiter gives you the wrong hamburger that happens to be kosher. So how do you deal with that, right? Do you need kapara or not? So it sounds from the Gemara, because the Gemara is about to equate, that's the first case the Gemara gave. The second case, let's just go back to the Gemara, is Kiyotze b'davarata omer. We're going to find another case that's the opposite. This is talking about an asham talui. An asham talui is a korban that we bring if we're like 50-50 we sin, 50-50 we didn't sin. We don't really know, right? Here, at least your intent was good. The problem is the waiter gave you the wrong sandwich. Not your fault. Intent was there, bad execution. Kagon, chaticha safek shel shuman, safek shel chelev. You weren't sure. You wanted a kosher sandwich. You ended up with one that's a 50-50 kosher. And that's when you have to bring a special asham taloi. Amar kravana savono mishin eskavan alus biado basar chazir va'ala biado basar chazir alach skama kama. So we're learning the same kal v'chomer, right? So could you imagine if you at least start, right, if you start on the right foot and it bombs, then you still have to bring a korban. Obviously, if you want to have non-kosher and you don't, and you end up eating non-kosher, obviously that's a problem also. So very, very beautiful. We don't have a lot of time. I just want to focus on one Meiri that I saw, if I could find it. The Meiri says, it brings on 1 second. I'm sorry, I lost it. But what he says is, we have a comparable Gemara. I just want to read this Gemara. It's a Gemara in Kiddushin. Okay, it's a famous Gemara at the end of Kiddushin, because again, we don't really understand this concept of bad intent. 99% of these cases are good intent that ends up in disaster. How do you have the opposite case? So the Gemara says, well, yeah, if you go to a restaurant and you want to eat non-kosher and they give you kosher, okay, that's one thing. Here's a story in Kiddushin 81b. Okay, here's a Gemara for the ages. Rabbi Chia bar Ashi have a ragil kol idan have a nafel la'ape. The Gemara talks about Rav Chia bar Ashi. Every time he said Tachnun, by the way, Tachnun is not mentioned a lot in Shas. It's mentioned, I think, twice, right? Once in Megillah that we had a class on about the Evan Maskis, if you remember, about a year and a half ago. Here we have another case of Tachnun, that anytime Rav Chia bar Ashi would say Tachnun, he would fall on his face. He would say the following: Harachman yatzileni miyetzer hara. He said, God, please prevent me from a yetzer hara. By the way, every day in the morning, right after brachas, we say, right, sheyatzileni miyetzer hara. We say a yihi ratzon, which is no, yes, correct. It is a Tanur case. It's also in Megillah about the Evan Maskis. So anyway, so getting back to this, we say, please save us in the yetzer hara. So one day, right, his wife heard him say this prayer, the Gemara says. Shamra devese amra michte kama shani you may parish leminai, right? She said, he hasn't been with me sexually in many, many years. He's much older than me, and we haven't been together in many, many years. Why does he say this? She doesn't understand what kind of yetzer hara does this person have, right? He's never with his wife, right? There's no concern he'll stray. So the Gemara says, Yom Achara v'kagaris beginta. One day he was studying, Chia bar Ashi was studying in his garden. Kashta nafshe. So his wife made herself look very, very young. She got herself dressed and she put on perfume and she walked past him. And of course, as the Gemara stories go, he didn't recognize her. And he said, who are you? She said, Manat, Amra Ana Charusa. My name is Charusa, right? Dahadre Miyoma, right? And my name is Charusa, a well-known prostitute, and I just finished my day's work. Tave, so he propositioned her. Amrle Aisi Nihada Lahach Rumna Deresh Tutsisa. She said to him, go up to the tree and give me that pomegranate as a payment. He swept up, he leaped up, right? Shavar Azal Aisi Nahali. He went up and brought down her pomegranate for her, and they did the deed. So Kiyasa Labesa, when he came home, Havekashagra Devisu Tanura, his wife was lighting a fire in the oven. Salik, right? He went into the oven, the Kayasev Bigave. He went in to the oven that was on fire. The discussion is, did he want to kill himself? Okay, we won't talk about that now. Amrullah, my hi. She said, what's going on? Amrullah, he said to her, Hachi v'hachi have maisa. This is what happened. I got to admit, right, like confession. You're never going to believe the sin I did. Amrullah, Ana havai. She said, I was that prostitute. Lo ashkuchba. He did not believe her. Adiyah simne, until she related the exact story to prove that she in fact was there. Then he finally believed her. Amar Allah, he said to her, Ana miha le'isuri chavna, right? So he ended up saying that, okay, I was saved, but my intent was to sin. By luck, right? The waiter giving the kosher hamburger, by luck, I got a kosher hamburger. It was my wife, but I didn't intend for it to be my wife. You could only see this in the Gemara, right? So he felt so guilty that he would fast for the rest of his days for the sin that he did, ad shemes ba'oso misa, until he died by that death. So what does that mean? So the Ben Yehoyada explains. First of all, he said, "Nearly lo haya b'taner lahava sheyisar." The fire wasn't on. The imken ma'abed atzmo biyadayim, because you can't. We're not allowed to commit suicide. You could certainly feel guilty about your sin, but you can't jump off a bridge. So he says, "Elarak haya eish bakarka." Okay, so it was just slightly on fire. He wanted just to burn his feet, so he has a good memory of the story. Right, anyway, so that's what the Ben Yehoyada says. And why his feet? Because his feet were right. He sprang up the tree, right, to get the pomegranate. So it was like mida keneged mida, and that's how he ended up dying. By his feet were on fire for the rest of his life. They were burnt, and that's what inevitably did him in. So the answer is yes. We do see a story how usually it's good intent and you have the unfortunate impact. Here you have the opposite. You have bad intent, but luckily he got saved. So what does this mean for us? Well, you could figure out it on your own way and see what in your life have you done where you try to do something wrong. Usually it's the opposite. The road to hell is 99% of the time. 1% of the time where you want to do bad and miraculously it ends up good. So, that's also equated by the Gemara as they're both bad, right? So I think that's a very interesting, way of looking at things. 9:02, gotta go. Any questions?
Yes, Yashikah.
Thank you.
Yes.